Alright, going to run through these first equations on the 5.3 note sheet. The directions I gave are solved by factoring, and just pointing out a couple things, especially with this first one. I'm going to let my writing play and see how this goes. So first I'm going to move everything over to one side, and we'll talk about in a little bit why I'm not just going to divide out the cosine. But once everything's on one side, then I can factor out the cosine there and split it just like we would if it was regular old variables. So we'll get cosine equals 0 and sine equals 3. So really helpful to know your unit circle or your sine cosine graphs. Make sure you're good on those, because for this one we get cosine equals 0 at pi over 2, and then 3 pi over 2 would be another angle, so I'm going to write it as pi over 2 plus pi n, and I'll draw it on the unit circle here. So cosine is 0 up at the top, right, when our coordinate is 0, 1, right, our cosine 0, and then also at 3 pi over 2, so I can just use pi n to represent that. On the other hand, sine is never equal 3, so we get no solution on that end there. So talking about down the bottom why we can't divide both sides by cosine, if you try it out at the beginning, so I'll rewrite this guy, and if I divide cosine out of both sides and just cross them out, I'm going to get sine x equals 3, and my whole answer would be no solution, which we saw up above right here. We do get solutions for this one. So you can't just get rid of a trig function or divide by it. You always want to move everything to one side and factor or use identities. So I'm going to go through the second one, number 2, as the last one for this group. But if you're feeling good, I would say just try them all out, and the answers are on the last page. You can check. The only other hint I have to help us out, I'll write loose solutions over here, is if a question ever looks just too overwhelming, you can always sub out variables for the trig functions, which is good practice because sometimes we'll kind of play around with the variables in the trig function, and they have to stay, like cosine x has to stay together. So I'm going to replace all the cosines with u's, and I'm going to move that root 2 over also. And now I could factor by grouping. And I'm going to let it go all the way through. Factor by grouping. Now don't forget, at the end we still need to put that cosine back in, so I'll put it as cosine equals now root 2 over 2, and then negative a half. Now the directions for this problem were a little bit different. It was just solutions on the interval from 0 to 2 pi. So that means we don't need to write them as equations. We just want to think about where our solutions are in the interval. So on the unit circle, cosine equals root 2 over 2 in quadrants 1 and 4 at pi over 4, and cosine's negative 1/2 at 2 pi over 3 and 4 pi over 3. So I'm just going to have a list of these answers. So pi over 4, 7 pi over 4, 2 pi over 3, and 4 pi over 3. And just make sure that your answers actually are in this interval from 0 to 2 pi. So I couldn't put like negative pi over 4, right? That's not on that interval up there. Alright guys, try out the rest in this section. I'll do another video for one in the next section, and good luck.